Welcome, everybody. It's the AIX Higher Ed Podcast Update for January 21st, 2026. It's just 3 weeks into the new year, and boy, a lot going on as typical. We have a number of key themes for this episode, including a lot of information and news coming out of the World Economic Forum at Davos this week. We'll talk about that, as well as some other issues related to Anthropic, U.S. government, educational space, and AI companies. And there's a lot going on. And so we're just going to cover some of these key themes.
We're going to change our focus. Each week we've tried to, update you and just hit almost all the major highlights. But what we're going to do from now on is to focus on 5 or 6 key themes. And then, on the Education Disrupted Substack that I run, where you can also find this podcast, there are some more details and, things we're not even going to talk about that'll give you a good, kind of weekly update about what's been happening. Right. So, Anand mentioned, Davos, over there in Davos, Switzerland, you have everyone in AI and all the world leaders. Trump just kind of went over there today and maybe heading back already. But, he's been over there. But the leaders of the AI companies and, even just other leaders, in industry are really talking about like how radical the changes are that, are kind of, it's not like 2 years into the future. They're basically starting to unfold. And, here, I'm sure you recognize this is Demis Hassabis, who runs Google DeepMind. And he's saying this isn't just another tool. I think people have been saying these things are tools so they don't scare people, go into schools and they just tell the teachers that they're tools. But these are civilization transforming technologies, right? Like he's saying this is bigger than the Industrial Revolution. And contextualizing this beyond just kind of saying, okay, agriculture to industry, it's even hard for people to imagine what's next. This is Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, and he's saying this is going to produce really radical changes in our economy, and it's going to lead to a lot of unemployment. He even talks about how JP Morgan is going to continue to expand, but as it continues to expand, it's going to have fewer employees over time. That doesn't mean that, no one will have a job, but fewer people are going to be employed. And he's even kind of trying to make the case that we really need to slow down this technology or we're going to have civil unrest. And, as educators, we don't have any ability really to slow down the technology in any practical way. So I think we need to be talking about, how we can help our students and how we can help society and people we know adapt, because these are very, very significant changes that are starting to unfold.
This question of the timeline is really important. And Demis Hassabis had a session with Dario Amodei, pictured here, CEO of Anthropic, and they were talking about their different perspectives, their different forecasts on timeline for when we would get to that point of AGI or getting to the stage where it would actually disrupt the labor markets. Demis Hassabis thinking it'll happen maybe a little bit longer. And Dario Amodei has said before that he thinks that it could be the technology to take over a lot of the knowledge work or white collar work in a much shorter time frame. And perhaps even in the next few years or in the year or two, being able to get to that point. In this case, he was talking about reaching a model that could do anything a human could do at the level of a Nobel laureate across many fields. And that's really how he's defining AGI. And he doesn't think that would take more than a few years. And I think what's really interesting about this is coming from the CEO of the company, Anthropic, that has had Claude Code and Claude Cowork, which we'll say a little bit more about, and you can certainly read a lot about. They're using these tools internally. And I think he probably has a better sense than a lot of other people in terms of what the capabilities are for self-recursive improvement. And that's really where you get to kind of a takeoff scenario where AI is able to build better AI and advance it very quickly. And so this is an important part of the timeline, discussion of the timeline, even if it's not nearly as fast as Dario Amodei is saying. People like Jamie Dimon are recognizing that this will be disruptive. It could lead to a lot of unrest and a lot of uncertainty. And that's something that we need to be ready to talk about and be able to help address in our classrooms.
And, here, this is, just a picture of Ray Kurzweil, but he was on the Mood Shots podcast. It was filmed maybe it seemed like about a week or so ago, and it was posted yesterday. And he's saying really the exact same thing that Dario Amodei is saying, and Demis Hassabis is saying yes the same thing a couple years later. He's saying by 2029 the AIs will be able to do what, essentially the equivalent, a Nobel laureate or the equivalent, whatever that is in every field. right? And he said there's different ways you can define jobs in fields. Some people say 700, 7,000, the way it's calculated. But he's saying like by 2029, that's when he thinks this is going to happen. And he even kind of says like, okay, well, what if I'm a couple years off? What's fascinating is that he's the oldest living AI scientist. He's been in AI for 61 years. He has like 24 honorary doctorates. Like 86% of his predictions have come true, really just because, and he just says, well, I just modeled it out. And the reason my predictions have been more accurate is because I kind of can do exponential modeling. And he's saying, it could be as early as 2027, right? He references that report. And to your point, it doesn't really matter. Like if it's like, well, say there's 7,000, it only gets to 6,500, or in 2027, you can do 5,000. And, the next year it's not going to happen all at once. But, this is one of the most respected AI scientists and researchers in the world. And, he's saying the same thing. So we're starting to see everybody really kind of coalesce around this basic idea of it happening probably by 2030.
I'm thinking a lot about this idea of how do we deal with forecasts. And with AI up to this point, there have been a lot of people saying, well, we aren't really sure that it'll ever happen, or it's possible that it could happen, or it'll happen decades or hundreds of years later than what some people are suggesting. What we're finding is that many of the experts and many of those that have been following it most closely are starting to reach some loose consensus, not on necessarily the exact timing, but that it is likely to happen sooner rather than later. And for some of them saying very soon. This week, much of the United States is dealing with a weather forecast for this weekend where they're saying it could be historic levels of snow. We have several days before we get to that point. If you go outside and you're thinking, well, it doesn't look like snow, it looks fine. But when we're dealing with the forecast, you're ready for the possibility of that happening and you prepare for the snowstorm. I think what we need to start doing is preparing our classrooms and our discussions and engaging in civil society to talk about what those changes likely will be, how we're going to address them, how we're going to prepare our students for them, and what that's going to look like. And I think there's a great chance that when we get through that transition, there's perhaps a world of abundance, and there are a lot of great possibilities. That transition is going to be incredibly important and difficult, very challenging for all of us. This is a learning opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to engage this as educators, to talk with students, not to scare them and not to start prognosticating about what exactly AGI is or how it's going to get there, but to start talking about what does work mean to us as part of our own meaning? What does it mean to prepare for a certain career? How can we remain flexible? How do you learn how to learn? These are great discussions that you can talk about in a very positive way. And so this discussion of AGI really should just prompt us to be more reflective about how we're talking about some of these issues with our students so that we can prepare them for a lot of turbulence, but with some flexibility, I think they'll be well prepared for it.
Just to look at a couple of concrete things, this is Dario Amodei again saying, okay, all software engineering will be automatable in 12 months. And, some people have given him a hard time. They said, it's like 6 months ago, we said 90% of coding will be done with AI. And it's not, people said, well, you said it said should, right? Because as you were talking about, and we'll talk about more that, obviously it's not entirely being done by AI now, but it's largely being done. Even the top people in Claude, the person who just created Claude Code, saying that Claude Code is writing all of the code now. But he's talking about senior people's jobs potentially being automated. And he even said in the discussion with Demis Hassabis, that's one thing they're starting to talk about in Anthropic, is they're not going to need as many people doing some of the jobs that they have people doing now because it's going to be automated with AI. And here's another example. Somebody. I guess I've never built a web browser, but people say that's like one of the hardest things that you could build. And the person here from Cursor, they use ChatGPT 2.5, which is also really good at coding. And they had it run for, I think it was a week uninterrupted. And it created like 3 million lines of code and it built a web browser autonomously. So that's kind of a concrete example of saying like, well, where is the capability of this technology?
And you're starting to hear from some software engineers and some experts in the area talking about what does this do to the value of software if you could just, as this person saying, one shot almost anything. It's not quite there yet. And even the Cursor engineer was talking about how it's not perfect, still making some mistakes. It's not quite there. But the fact that it can work autonomously for a week and be able to write 3 million lines of code and get something that is fairly functional is a huge step forward in terms of what you're able to do with this. And this gets to the story that Stefan was mentioning, that the engineer at Anthropic, who was Boris Cherny, who created Claude Code, what they decided to do was to create something that could be used by non-coders. And so they built Cowork, and that just came out this last week. They built it in a week and a half, and they built it with Claude Code. The fact that they could do it that quickly was astonishing. The fact that they were doing it with their own AI tools to be able to build it that well and that quickly is doubly astonishing. I mean, it's really a marker in terms of the development of AI for software engineering, for getting to the stage of at least closer to self-recursive improvement, where it's able to work autonomously, still being guided by a human. But we don't know how much longer before you have something that's maybe working autonomously for a week, guiding new developments that we didn't originally program. And that's certainly in the realm of possibility at this stage.
And, this kind of brings us, these coders when it's operating the code, right? I mean, these are agentic coders, right? They're agents, right? They're trained, and then they take action in their environment, multi-step action. And I started using Cowork, and I explained in one of my last Substacks where I wrote about kind of organized all the debate and AI stuff I had done, how I used it. And I just asked it to do some things, and it did do like multi-step work. And when it got stuck, sometimes it just it said, oh, I'm stuck. I write a script, and it would say, oh, well, now I've learned there's a more efficient way to do this. Started guessing the URLs accurately and some of the documents, and organizing a lot of my files for me. And, like I say, it was pretty impressive. It would unstick itself. But my point here is these are agents that are doing things. And, McKinsey says that they now have 60,000 employees, but 25,000 of them are AI agents, which I guess I can do this math, right? So they have 35,000 human employees, and they have 25,000 agents. So almost half their workforce is non-human. I mean, that's quite shocking. And don't forget, those humans are probably, I think, these consulting companies, you have to work a lot of hours, but not 24. The agents are probably working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The humans, I mean, if they're putting in 100 hours, they're probably not doing that. I know they work a lot, but and no drama, no getting sick. I had bronchitis last week. I couldn't record the podcast. The agents don't get bronchitis.
We just needed a podcasting agent to replace either of us when we're sick, and then we're all set. This from Sequoia Capital in a really interesting post talking about this, that we've reached AGI, and talking about a functional kind of definition of AGI, saying that the applications of this year and next will be doers. They'll feel like colleagues. Usages can go from a few times a day to all day, every day, with multiple instances running in parallel, along the lines of what Stefan was just talking about, the McKinsey's experiencing and that others will be experiencing. We're moving away from discussion and chat-based interactions to being able to manage agentic workflows. And that's a very different framework for the workflow. And to be able to think about how to do that work, we should be thinking about how we introduce that to students. And we've talked before about this. We need to start introducing more of the durable skills, the collaborative skills, so students are used to directing one another, and then they can apply some of those same skill sets to agentic work once that's introduced. But that's going to take them a little while, because students aren't often given that kind of agency or autonomy to be able to have control over other workflows or other people. They don't often take direction from one another very well. They need to learn how to do it. And that's going to be part of the collaborative work set that they need.
And, this is just from the same report, right? Just kind of explaining what agentic AI is. An AI that can figure things out, right? Some basic knowledge, right? It went through pre-training. The ability to reason over that knowledge, which happens at the inference time, right? When it's processing, essentially. The response to the prompt, and that's when we saw the initial reasoning models, like it was ChatGPT 4.01 or 3. I forget the number, but that was the initial reasoning model. But then the ability to iterate its way, right, to answer the thing, like the long horizon agents. Like I say, when I use Cowork, it basically worked for about an hour and solved its own problems. Now, in this publication, they're saying this is like AGI. There's a debate over that, obviously, because, Sam Altman originally, and even like, I think it was like August 2022, I listened to a podcast and said, well, if it can do the work of a remote worker, that's AGI. That's like a very, kind of narrow definition, right? And then we could say, okay, well, maybe AGI is also this knowledge that everybody has. And it's also, its ability to go about in the physical world, right? It's not there yet on those criteria, but it's there. The other thing I wanted to mention, we were talking about, what Ray Kurzweil and Demis Hassabis and people saying, well, it's going to have all the individual knowledge of, every top person in their field. One thing that Ray pointed out is it's going to be able to combine and synthesize all that knowledge, right? And he said, most people, they're really only an expert in one area. Maybe they pick up some additional, expertise. You see people in an area and then they get a law degree or, some other degree to, help them with their job, but they're not really a top lawyer, right? And a top doctor, right? They just kind of have that kind of additional knowledge there to help them out. But, imagine that you have all the knowledge, in hundreds of fields and you can just instantly synthesize it, right? I always think in debate, I can do some synthesis across fields because in debate, I've learned a good amount about everything, right? But I not like, PhD level knowledge in those fields. I'm not an expert in those fields. So I'm thinking, well, if I can kind of synthesize somewhat between ideas and fields, imagine someone with a PhD in each of those fields and, one of the very best people. It would just be, it's hard to really even understand what kind of knowledge and learning that would unpack.
And I think what's really key about that to kind of contextualize this is that most of the time we're thinking about AI doing the work that humans do. And we're only thinking about it in terms of human interaction and human performance. But if you're getting beyond that to the point where it's able to do expert level, beyond expert level in multiple fields, it's not just replacing then multiple people in different fields, but that's synthesis of different perspectives, different knowledge bases is something that we've never seen humans perform with. And it's so rare to find somebody that's performing at that level in one area, maybe two, and you can think about what they're capable of doing. It just brings forth a lot of sci-fi examples where you think of somebody that kind of has the brain unlocked and they're able to do so much more. What we're really talking about is within a short period of time, perhaps a couple of years, 3 or 4 or 5 years, that AI will be able to perform at that level and provide new perspectives and new knowledge base. And that'll really change the game.
And, one thing, and I've written about this more in the debate context, right? And is the idea of collective intelligence, right? We often treat like intelligence as each person's own. And there's a lot of talk about this, right? With teachers and professors, each person needs to do their original work, right? And, I'm not saying that there's no value to that, but really when intelligence works well, like, you think of a corporation, all these people kind of working together, right? They can produce something greater than kind of the individual parts. And they're finding when these kind of agents essentially work together and they kind of build a collaborative intelligence, which Google calls a society of thought. And, that's one thing that I think reasons people are kind of underestimating the powers of these models. They just think like what an individual model can do. Well, what if you have essentially, you have agents within a model, right? That each agent's not its own model, but absent kind of like, kind of those technical details. What do you do when you have like a swarm? They call them agent swarms of say 1 million agents or more, like working together to tackle a problem. That's obviously gonna, it's just incredible.
This gets into some of the discussion that we were having before about the impact especially with job disruptions impacting the labor market. There are a lot of fears mounting about layoffs, and in this case, likening it to a tsunami. This is something that, a lot of analysts were saying this is what was happening the last year or so. Others have said, well, that was probably because of overhiring during the pandemic. But now we're seeing earlier signs that there are indications of layoffs. You see more companies like McKinsey adopting agentic workflows. That's the first step toward then replacing certain workflows for humans, and then actually leading to other layoffs. And so we're going to see more stories like this that are coming out. This is coming out of a lot of the conversations of the World Economic Forum in Davos. And we're certainly going to see this as they start thinking about new applications within the business sector.
And, this is Demis Hassabis saying like, okay, well, this year, yeah, there are going to be entry-level jobs. They're going to be hard to get. There aren't going to be a lot of them. And, even internships, right? And, you think of internship, well, you're trying to help the person, but the company's also kind of getting something out of it. And they're just not really going to need the interns anymore. They're not going to need the entry-level people. And obviously, these things can compound, right? Like it's like the economy is obviously, it's kind of a K-shaped economy, right? At the very top of the market, it's doing well, but a lot of other businesses are not doing well and consumers are struggling, right? So if companies start to struggle, they're not at the very top, right? And they need to cut costs. I mean, labor is usually one of the most significant costs of a business, right? So they can replace that with an AI and get their expenses down in that way. Because they're experiencing other financial pressure, these things are going to come.
The other aspect of this to remember is that even if there's no further development, if for some reason every bit of AI research stopped immediately, the capabilities that are there right now will already impact entry-level jobs and internships. So the very least that we need to be doing is preparing our students to be able to compete, not for entry-level jobs or internships, but really for mid-level work, the kind of work that they would typically have a few years of experience before they would get. And the way to do that is to be able to start introducing some more advanced skill sets, including the durable skills that we've talked quite a bit about, but I think the management skills, the supervisory skills, and starting to incorporate some more advanced AI skills and literacy so that they're able to then work with some agentic workflows. I was talking with a colleague and corresponding with them about this. They were talking with some industry leaders in Northern Virginia saying that many of these companies are expecting recent graduates to be ready to program, develop agentic workflows. And that's not something that most schools are preparing their undergraduates for, certainly. We're trying to figure out how in most schools that AI is being introduced in a very basic level, and we're just thinking about chatbots, we need to start thinking a little further along the line to think, what are they going to be able to do with it? And it's not just the technical aspect. It's really about being able to manage, supervise, and then orchestrate the work that's going to be done by those agentic workflows. That's something we need to be able to prepare our students to do.
Let's just, briefly say, okay, Grok, right? Now Elon Musk, I guess, is worth almost $800 billion. They really have a plan to automate white-collar work. That's why, they think this is worth a lot of money. It's just another example. And, but it's not, it can obviously be discouraging, right? And I think it is a way like conceptually discouraging because kind of white collar work, that was until the last couple of years, that's what I thought, okay, that's like how you move, into the middle class or up the middle class. It's kind of how you move the economic ladder is to be able to do this knowledge work well. And, like I say, there's still some value in that, right? But it's going to be really hard to get paid to do a lot of knowledge work in the future. But that doesn't mean, it's over. Like Alex Karp, from Palantir says, look, you need to, focus on vocational training. That's something a lot of, parents like can't imagine, their kids doing vocational work. Now, we did talk about that in the podcast, even in wealthier communities like Lexington, Massachusetts, they're realizing like, yeah, the kids need, some vocational training, but it's just hard. Jensen Wong from NVIDIA was talking to Davos saying, look, there's electricians and plumbers that make like $200,000 a year, out there, right? So we always kind of assume that, developing the knowledge, that's how you would get to that salary. That's basically a starting attorney salary in New York now is a little bit above $200,000. You could graduate from high school and, get some training as an electrician. Obviously, if you go to public school, some of the CTE programs provide that. And, maybe you won't start at 100,000, but you're probably going to start at least, $70,000, $100,000. And, the other thing to think about, and, I've been saying this, you've been saying it, other people have been saying it kind of sound like broken records is, be an entrepreneur. You were talking earlier about managing these agents. You can build businesses. You don't need to hire all of these employers. Peter Diamandis says the future of work is entrepreneurship. I've been saying I think everyone who graduates from high school should do, some experience with starting a business. Whereas now there's just kind of an elective that some kids do or something like that. And it's just pretty basic like cash accounting or something that they're teaching you, right? So, but we're probably going to need to up that.
And it's not just looking for single person unicorns, as the CEO of Robinhood is talking about, but we need to also develop the entrepreneurial skills. So it's really about a mindset of being able to identify problems and develop solutions to those problems. We're not typically developing that skill set or encouraging that for most workers because they all don't need to be doing that in a very traditional workplace. That's typically done by somebody that's mid-level manager or somebody higher up that is then addressing some of those problems. The economy is changing much faster now, and the needs of the market are changing much faster. The entrepreneurial skills are not just about somebody going and starting their own company. If you're going to be hiring for your own company and you have a limited number of humans you're going to be hiring, you probably want somebody that's fairly adaptable, that has an entrepreneurial spirit, that is able to think about how they can be flexible to address the problems that your company is trying to meet and to be able to develop those solutions. We aren't looking anymore in most jobs for somebody that's going to be, the cookie cutter copy of what we've had before in that job. We're going to be looking for flexibility. That entrepreneurship is a lot more than just those individuals trying to seek unicorn status and build their own billion-dollar company. It's also about the everyday worker. Then we've never really thought about applying it that way before.
And, you can take it farther, Ethan Mogpost. I mean, this is with MBA students he's working with, right? So it's a little different. I mean, I've done it in middle school, high school students, and your college students or your MBA students. But he's talking about like vibe coding, a company. Essentially vibe, I don't know if you said coding, right?
Vibe founding.
Vibe founding a business, right? So And you can see the technology is just getting so good. You kind of get, that MBA level knowledge. You can put the whole company together pretty quickly. And he's saying, I think it says it in this post, like, let's just take them like a whole semester. They might not even be able to do it in a semester. Now they can do it like a couple weeks. So
I think what this really underscores for me is something that the Ray Kurzweil interview talks about that we've heard in some other sectors before, and that is everything is speeding up and everything is accelerating. And that's part of the exponential trend, is that as the change is occurring in technology, that's speeding up then all of the reactions, all of the actions that'll be taking place. When you have an example where even in an MBA program, the quality of Wharton, where they would have an entrepreneurship class where they would spend the entire semester building a course or building that company, and now they could found something in just a matter of days. That's going to continue to accelerate. And that's where we see developments in biomedical research, where they're thinking about being able to run thousands of tests and experiments over a short period of time that before would have taken many years. Now we're thinking about breakthroughs happening because they can do the research that much faster. That's also going to mean for economic activity, things are going to happen much faster. We're going to experience a lot of turmoil and a lot of change, but we're going to have the flexibility to be able to adapt to it. And hopefully, at least, and the tools will help us do that. But this is an example of how we need to start incorporating that into the classroom too. We need to prepare our students for that level of acceleration, that kind of change, just to be open to it, because it takes a different level of flexibility in your mind to process how quickly something is happening in a market, how quickly something is going to happen within the workplace. And that comes with practice. We have to be able to do that in our coursework too.
And, so we have jobs, but, there's also this reality of like the government's going to have to kind of help manage this inequality, right? That's created. Like, Hassabis is saying, like, we're going to have to approach these problems. There's going to be a lot of unemployment and there's going to be a lot of hard questions. Also, recently, today, there's an education conference going on, I think in London, called BET. And so, some companies are rolling out new products. Google announced that, and the Gemini for teachers, and now it's like Gemini Pro, and the email responders, and, they made a partnership with, I forget who, but you can do all your SAT practice, right in the Gemini for free. All the students can. And it's kind of, it's interesting if you think about it. The one time, you're one hand, you had the Demis Hassabis, the CEO of DeepMind, saying, well, we're going to have a lot of unemployment, especially in the knowledge work sector. And the other thing they're saying, but hey, it's great. You can study for the SAT for free. And it's not like in this new economy and this transition that, there's no value to studying for the SAT, but it's quite a juxtaposition. Like, it's like, here's all these new awesome tools, right? And they seem pretty great. It'll take a while to be able to use them. These new opportunities. A lot of kids pay a lot of money for SAT prep, and every kid can't afford that. So it's great in many ways, but it's like, here's some new ways to help yourself, learn the skills to be a knowledge worker. But, there aren't going to be that many jobs left at JP Morgan. And it's just, I have a solution. I'm not saying that there aren't going to be any more knowledge worker jobs, but it's something I'm sure that students are struggling with.
Absolutely.
And, this is the Anthropic, we keep talking about the same people a lot, but, they're saying the same thing, right? We have to, probably some of this has to get redistributed, this wealth that's getting concentrated at the top.
And that's where the transition is going to be particularly difficult, is getting to the point where that is recognized and then action is taken.
And Ray Kurzweil, we mentioned earlier, he's saying, he goes, oh yeah, but, 2030, we'll need something, 2030s, we're going to have something like universal basic income, which is almost hard to imagine, like in the United States, right? Because look, it is a reality. Like our total debt's like basically approaching $40 trillion. And, there's not a lot of support. They're still fighting even just about extending, healthcare subsidies, right? So it's like the idea that we would have some kind of universal basic income or services is difficult to imagine.
It is, but as we're talking about every trend accelerating in society, I think that it's not going to take long before those discussions have to take place and they figure out what to do with it. In this story, Claude's Constitution, and this is something we've mentioned in some past podcasts. One thing about Anthropic when they created Claude is they built it with it's called constitutional AI, which means that it has this constitution outlining the character of the model, its actions, and its intent. And they've just updated that. And this new constitution is really telling, because it says a lot about what Anthropic thinks about what's coming next, how this is being developed. And they're framing this in a way that they really want Claude to have a higher baseline happiness. And they're looking at the well-being of the model, not to anthropomorphize it. What they're recognizing, though, is that we're getting closer to the point where perhaps there is some sense of consciousness or some awareness that could occur when we're developing these models further. And that's what a lot of this constitution is dealing with, is how will Claude, if it gets those glimmers of self-awareness, deal with recognizing its own limitations, recognizing that it's there to serve people, that it has its memory erased after every chat, that it could be running in multiple instances at the same time. These are all the kinds of questions that a person would be thinking about if they found themselves in that situation. And so within this constitution, it's very telling about where Anthropic thinks the next steps might lead us. Certainly within discussions about what the model might be doing and how it might be reacting.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, to bring the Ray Kurzweil back in, and they asked him about this, like, oh, well, do you think it's conscious, right? And he pointed out something, we say all the time, there's no exact definition of consciousness, and there's no tests, and just kind of based on how we interact, I do think you're conscious, right? So I hope you think I'm conscious, but it's just kind of like there's no test. I can't prove that you're conscious. But he says, by the early 2030s, most people think their AI is conscious. He points out that people who have used AI for therapy, which is starting to become pretty widespread. Obviously, if the people dating AIs, formal relationships with AIs, are going to think it's conscious. So this is something that's going to happen, and I've seen reactions to this, on LinkedIn. I don't really use Twitter, but on LinkedIn, some people are like, oh yeah, they get it. Other people are just like angry that, think they've lost their minds, so to speak, because they've said that it's conscious. But a lot of more people are starting to say this. And you also started thinking about religion. It's kind of hard to prove that God exists, right? But a lot of people believe that, even though it can't be proven. And they'll even say, well, I can't prove it. It's my faith. And that's what makes it extra special. So, I don't really, if we can say that, if you can just say, well, I believe something, right? And that, it's just true, which is fine. I mean, you can believe what you want, right? I don't mean to sound like I'm criticizing it, but then, why can't somebody believe that AI is conscious and interact with it? Kind of in that way, based on their own personal experience, just like they might have had a religious experience or, some reason to be connected.
Now, even if you're really skeptical of that line, recognize that the models are going to exhibit more traits and more characteristics that might lead people to believe that there's consciousness or self-awareness there. And this is particularly important when we're dealing with students who are starting to turn to AI models for companionship, for counseling. And they're more likely to start to see some of those signs, especially if they don't have a lot of background or experience in terms of how this is working or what's happening. They're more likely to start to experience that and feel that there is something there. There's some glimmer of self-awareness, of consciousness, and they'll view it akin to a person. And we need to be ready for that and to be able to support students. And, we're all going to get to the stage where we're going to start to wonder, where is the bright line between just a large language model that's generating text as a stochastic parrot and eventually getting to something that maybe is self-aware. A lot there to unpack, and certainly something we'll be exploring further down the road.
And, this was just released today. It was called from the Council of Economic Intelligence and Council of Economic Advisors in the U.S. government, called Artificial Intelligence and the Great Divergence. And I thought it was going to have some, wild claims or super interesting stuff, but it didn't really. It was just talking about how a lot more people were using AI and companies were using AI, and it showed some of the gains in agentic AI, which are actually dated because it was quoting studies that were just a couple months. But what I thought was really interesting, if you click onto the next slide, is really just a conclusion. It's like, hey, it says we're experiencing an AI revolution, and we don't want any regulation. We don't want to slow this down, like, in any way. We have executive orders from the Trump administration, that are really kind of pushing out, like, AI, trying to block regulations. So, to circle back kind of to what we had, the beginning of the podcast, and that's, wanted to make sure we added, the Jamie Dimon stuff, saying, this is coming and it's going to disrupt the economy, and it might generate civil unrest, and we need to slow it down, right? There were these initial calls to slow down AI so it didn't, like, take over the world. He's not making that argument at all. He's just saying it's going to create mass disruption and we need to slow it down. And then we have the U.S. government saying, like, no, we're not going to slow it down at all. In fact, we're gonna put our foot on the gas. It's just it's going to be troubling. It's going to be troubling times. But the way to deal with that is not to despair. It's to work with students and talk to people.
Yeah, I thought it was really telling within this report that they were very clear that this is an economic inflection point that is a divergence akin to the Industrial Revolution, but happening much faster. And, we've said this before, others have certainly been saying this for a while, but for the Council of Economic Advisors to be saying it in these terms and to be outlining the intent to go as fast as possible to not slow down, even though they see that kind of change happening, is really eye-opening.
And, to kind of, we get to the end and, I know you and, we kind of push schools or I definitely kind of, push you. You're better, at the politics of the push than I am. But, it's like I spent all my life in education. Obviously I was a student, I worked at high schools, universities. I've coached middle school debate, even though I did middle school teaching. Student teaching, but I never could have taught middle school. I have the patience for that. But, I've engaged all levels of kids, all in different parts of the world, all different types of academic institutions. And I've enjoyed my time in education, but I kind of worry that they're kind of abdicating a little bit, not entirely. People are trying and some people are in tough spots and some people are they don't really understand the magnitude of the change. But we don't want to just kind of leave it to the AI companies. I mean, I think it's great that Gemini came out with all this stuff today. OpenAI kind of added some things that we'll see on the next slide. They're partnering, but it almost seems like the companies are, kind of saying, well, okay, I think they feel a responsibility. I'm sure they want to make money as well, but I think they also feel a responsibility to help educate students to understand. And if you flip onto the next slide, it's talking about them doing worker training on educating teachers. And Anthropic yesterday, I can't even keep track anymore. It's like yesterday or this morning, Anthropic announced a big thing to help teachers kind of learn about AI. So the companies are starting to shoulder a lot of what we traditionally took responsibility for in the educational system.
And it's really hard to blame the schools because I think one thing it does demonstrate is an awareness that this space is moving very quickly, that they might not have the resources, the means to be able to fully address it. And so bringing in industry might not be a bad idea. I think that what I'd be calling for, though, is that instead of these companies trying to work on monopolizing a particular school and saying, well, now you're a Google school or a ChatGPT school, an Anthropic school, maybe they should be providing a lot of these training materials, access to a lot of the tools to school free or subsidized in some important way, because that's the way that they can really give back. And we need to make sure that within the classroom, we're not talking about just one company and not just preparing a market for that company. We need to be preparing students to think critically about all of the tools in important ways. And I think the companies can provide a lot of the foundation for that to occur. But we need to be a part of that. And it needs to be some partnership. So, I think that Stefan's right. Some of the schools are just kind of abdicating their responsibility here. But I can kind of get it for some schools. If they just don't have the means, this is one avenue to explore. Let's talk about being able to bring many of the companies together and use the resources more wholly and openly and making them available.
And the last thing is, we're just gonna have to adapt. It's gonna be difficult. Another time to make that concrete. And this is kind of a prediction. Right? You're talking about prediction. The president, I think, of Brandeis, he thinks 25% of U.S. colleges are headed for closure, and he thinks that kind of the regional local colleges, community colleges are mostly going to be providing things online, which is good, right? That's going to help sustain the kind of those jobs and all the intellectual. I always said there's so much intellectual energy and knowledge in a university that I think sometimes we're forgetting about. So it'll sustain all that, but it's going to kind of make college. It's going to completely change the game of college admissions, or people are competing for limited slots. Maybe in the top 50, they'll be still competing for limited slots, but those schools are already starting to offer some versions of online courses that basically anybody can take, right? So, in high school, the competition, you got to get good grades so you can go to the school you want to go to. I mean, I still encourage kids to get good grades, but it can't really be about probably going to the school you want to go to because you're going to have a lot of choices.
I mean, it really is the perfect storm for higher ed in that there are a number of other factors aside from AI that are causing a number of these closures, or will likely lead to a number of closures. The demographic cliff, decreasing public support, a concern in public sentiment, loss of public sentiment in support of a 4-year education and worrying about a return on investment. And then you add to it the disruption that'll happen economically and with the job market because of AI. There are a lot of questions about how does a traditional institution address those needs? And in some cases, it doesn't. And that's why we need to be able to adapt. It's not a matter of looking at it as a faculty member. I can't look at it as the way that I've always taught at my school with the same curriculum versus moving toward AI. I think I would probably lean toward, I've done it well before. We've always had it this way. Why wouldn't we keep that? That's not the case. It's probably going to be learn to adapt and try to make sure that you're retaining what you think is really important about that curriculum, and then adapt the rest of it to the needs of the students. That's really who we're there to serve. And if we don't, then we probably are open to more criticism from the public. And unfortunately, none of those schools are going to end up closing because the demand won't be there. It shouldn't be simple market dynamics. It shouldn't just be a simple demand mechanism as to whether or not somebody stays open, but we have to recognize that that is part of it. And if we're not meeting the needs of the market and the needs of the populace, then we need to be wondering what it is that we're doing. So this level of adaptation is something we've never really seen in higher ed in the United States. And it's something that's going to have to happen very quickly.
Thank you for listening. Please maybe just think about something you can do, big or small, right, to help your students, right, as you know, they're gonna grow up in this world, right? They're gonna face these challenges, but also AI provides them a lot of opportunities. But as I was telling a couple students earlier, today, that these decisions about how AI is conscious, how we're going to treat it, how wealth is or is not distributed. These are all the changes that are going to define their lives as they grow into adulthood. And to kind of help them start tackling these questions.
So as Stefan mentioned at the very top of the podcast, his Substack, Education Disrupted, is going to continue to have all of the updates in a number of different categories. And we're going to plan on just selecting a few of them to highlight each week. If there are particular areas you'd like to see us talk about, that you'd like us to bring some attention to, send us an email. And you can find the email on our website, aixhighered.com. And we look forward to hearing your feedback. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, Stefan.
Thanks, Anand.